I heard the knock just before sunrise. Not the gentle kind. The kind that says, "Open this door, or we'll open it for you." 3 sharp bangs. Then, silence. I stepped into the hallway, still in my slippers, blinking away sleep, heart thudding. Outside my door stood 2 men in reflective vests, clipboards in hand. Behind them, a truck, a ladder, and the unmistakable silhouette of a roofing crew unloading tiles onto my front lawn. "What's going on?" I asked, pulling my robe tighter. "It's 6 a.m. The older of the 2 didn't look up from his clipboard. HOA work order. Section 17B, non-compliant roofing material. Demolition scheduled for today. I blinked, stunned. "You're demolishing my roof?" The younger one shrugged. "Orders from the board. We're just here to follow 'em." And just like that, the first hammer hit the shingles. What they didn't know, what the HOA had never bothered to ask, was that I had designed that roof myself. Because I'm not just a homeowner. I'm the senior structural engineer who helped draft the state's residential building code. And if they thought they could bring down my roof with a bogus violation, they had no idea what kind of storm they were stepping into. The real story had begun 3 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday afternoon that felt like any other. I was returning home from a meeting with the state's licensing board when I noticed a note taped to my front door. It was folded twice, the print in bold red ink. Notice of violation. Roof material incompatibility. West Hill Ridge HOA. At first I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was ridiculous. The roof in question had been fully permitted, inspected, and certified by the city 3 months prior. It was made from a lightweight composite shingle blend I had co-developed for high humidity regions like ours. It passed fire, wind, and structural load testing with flying colors. I'd written white papers about it. I had patents on the formulation. And yet, here I was, standing in front of my own house, holding a citation from a woman who sold real estate 6 years ago and now ran the HOA board like a private army. Her name? Deborah Langley. Newly elected president of the West Hill Ridge HOA. Nickname around the block? The Queen of Compliance. I didn't know it yet, but Deborah had just made me her next target. The next HOA newsletter featured a bolded section titled, "Roofing Uniformity and Community Aesthetic Preservation." She never said my name, but the message was clear. One homeowner's innovative roof was another's visual disruption. Then came the whispers from neighbors. "I heard you used banned materials. Deborah said your roof could lower property values. Someone said it might collapse under snow weight." It didn't matter that we lived in Florida. It didn't matter that the roof was structurally sound. The court of HOA opinion had already ruled against me. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I gathered my permits. I printed the inspection reports. I even called in the municipal engineer who had signed off on the project. And then I sent everything, nicely packaged, to Deborah's office, with a polite cover letter explaining the roof's full compliance with local and state regulations. Her response? A second notice. This time marked urgent, and this time she added something new. Failure to comply will result in forced contractor intervention at owner's expense. That was the first time I felt the shift. This wasn't about aesthetics. It wasn't about rules. It was about power. Deborah wasn't enforcing the code. She was challenging mine. So I started digging. And what I found was even worse than I expected. You see, Deborah had been quietly rewriting sections of the HOA's design regulations over the past 6 months. Most of it was minor: shrub heights, fence colors, mailbox shapes. But tucked inside her latest revision was a new clause. All roofing materials must conform to the visual standards of traditional slate 5.3 pattern or equivalent as determined solely by the HOA president. That clause wasn't in the original bylaws. It hadn't been voted on. And it gave her unilateral authority to deem any roof non-conforming. Even mine. Even if it had passed every legal requirement under state law. So I called the city again. This time, I didn't ask for the building department. I asked for the code enforcement officer. And I asked for a transcript of Deborah Langley's last zoning complaint, because I had a hunch this wasn't her first overreach. While I waited for the documents, I decided to make one last appeal. I emailed Deborah personally, not as a resident. As the engineer who wrote the chapter she was now trying to bend. I kept the tone civil. I explained the testing, the permits, the fact that her actions could be considered willful interference in a matter of structural safety. She never responded, but I knew she read it, because 2 days later, the work crew showed up. No warning, no final notice, just hammers. And as I stood on my lawn watching the first tiles fall, I realized something. She wasn't just ignoring the law. She was betting no one would have the power, or the will, to fight back. But that's the thing about engineers. We don't just build things, we document them. We defend them. And when necessary, we bring down the ones who think they're above the rules. I thought the fallout from the HOA's unlawful demolition would be swift. A fine, maybe a forced apology. But what I didn't expect was silence. No new letters, no more emails, no clipboard-wielding board members pacing outside my fence. Just quiet. And that, right there, was the real alarm bell. Because when people like Karen Chambers go quiet, it's not peace. It's planning. The first sign came 2 mornings later. My trash bins, which I'd left out for pickup like always, hadn't just been moved. They were gone. Vanished. No bin on the side of the house. No sign of wind, raccoons, or bored teenagers. Just a clean patch of concrete where they used to sit. I called the city's sanitation department. "No, sir," the clerk said. "We didn't remove anything. That's not our protocol unless we receive a request from the HOA." I didn't even need to ask who made the request. It was a message. Not loud. Not messy. But personal. Targeted. So I waited. I watched. And, sure enough, it came. A note. Folded. Sealed. Placed under my windshield wiper while I was parked at the hardware store. Typed. Anonymous. "You embarrassed her. She doesn't forget." That night I reviewed every frame of my security footage. Nothing. Whoever left it knew where the blind spots were. The next morning, a neighbor texted me. "You okay?" I asked why. She sent a photo. My name was on the HOA's internal message board again, the one only accessible to registered members. Someone had flagged my property as potentially hazardous to community aesthetic. And the kicker? A blurry photo of me, taken through my own fence. Karen wasn't backing down. She was building a case. Only this time she was smarter, slower, layered. This wasn't a war of jackhammers anymore. This was psychological warfare. A slow bleed of power meant to isolate, discredit, and wear me down. But I'd dealt with people like her before. Developers who used intimidation to force families out. Inspectors who took bribes to look the other way. This was no different. So I started documenting. Every knock on the door. Every car that lingered too long. Every anonymous citation from the newly created Environmental Review Subcommittee Karen had conveniently formed last week. I built a wall, not of brick, but of evidence. And then, something unexpected happened. Gerald knocked on my door. The same Gerald who dropped his clipboard during Karen's fake inspection. "Can we talk?" he asked. I nodded and stepped aside. He looked nervous, glancing around like he was being watched. "She's going too far," he said. "The stuff she's asking us to do? It's illegal. She's writing violations and telling us to sign them retroactively." I said nothing. Just let him talk. She had me follow Mrs. Kim. Like, follow her. She said she was monitoring home activity inconsistency. It made me sick. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because she's planning something big. She says you're trying to dismantle the HOA from within. She's got the board riled up. Wants to push an emergency vote to ban any current county employees from owning property here." That stopped me cold. That wasn't just unethical. That was unconstitutional. "Do you have proof?" I asked. He pulled out a USB drive. Meeting recordings. Emails. I couldn't just sit by anymore. I took it. Carefully. Slowly. This wasn't just about me anymore. Karen was trying to rewrite the rules to protect herself, and anyone who got in her way was collateral. The Zygarnik tension was rising now, and I had to make sure I didn't release it too soon. So I did the one thing she'd never expect. I stayed quiet. I didn't file complaints, didn't show up to board meetings, didn't respond to the next 3 fines she mailed me for paint sheen irregularity, bird feeder non-compliance, and inappropriate shrub height. I let her keep pushing. Because the more she pushed, the more she exposed herself. And while she was busy stacking lies, I was building something stronger. A coalition. 3 neighbors joined me, then 6, then 11. We didn't start with protests. We started with stories. The Rodriguezes shared how Karen once threatened to call CPS over a trampoline. The Singhs showed photos of their decorative fountain being forcibly removed. Mrs. Kim? She just brought cookies. Because sometimes resistance starts with kindness. We met in garages, backyards, libraries. We didn't talk about revenge. We talked about accountability. And when I told them about Gerald's USB drive, something changed. Hope. Fear. A sense that something bigger was finally possible. But we weren't ready yet. We needed one more thing. A crack big enough for everyone to see. And it came, not in the form of a document or a fine, but in the sound of a scream. The scream echoed down the street at exactly 6:42 a.m. It wasn't a siren. It wasn't an alarm. It was a human scream. Raw. Choked with panic and disbelief. I dropped my coffee and rushed to the front door, heart pounding. When I stepped outside, I saw Mrs. Rodriguez on her knees in the middle of her lawn, hands trembling, phone clutched tight, staring at the muddy work truck lodged halfway into her yard. Her flower beds, gone, her wooden fence, split in half, her daughter's custom wheelchair ramp, already in pieces. My stomach dropped. Elif's garden, she whispered, voice cracking. They destroyed it. Neighbors poured out of their homes, still in pajamas, drawn by the chaos. A few gasped. One man shouted. But no one moved. Frozen by the sight of what was unfolding. A man in a reflective vest stepped down from the truck, clipboard in hand. Sorry, ma'am. Just following orders. HOA directive. Landscaping violation. I stepped forward. Violation of what exactly? That ramp was approved. I saw the documents myself. He shrugged. Didn't come from me. We were just told it was non-compliant. Told to remove it today. And then, she appeared. Karen Chambers, arms crossed, sunglasses on, clipboard in hand like a badge of power. What seems to be the problem here? She asked with that sickeningly sweet tone she reserved for public disasters of her own making. Mrs. Rodriguez stood shakily. That was for my daughter. She has cerebral palsy. It's the only place she can safely sit outside and enjoy the sun. We sent the medical documentation. You approved it. Karen flipped through her folder theatrically. I don't see any such exemption. And the HOA guidelines clearly prohibit concrete surfaces in the front yard, unless for driveways or emergency access. I stepped in. That was emergency access. That ramp is ADA compliant and medically required. Removing it could expose this entire HOA to a civil lawsuit. She turned to me, that smirk still in place. Are you threatening me, Mr. Langston? No, I said calmly. I'm informing you. There's a difference. She didn't like that. But before she could respond, a voice rose from the crowd. Mr. Patel. You tore out my father's tomato planters last week, he said. Now this? A ramp for a disabled child? More murmurs. Then more voices. What about the Wilson string lights? And my mailbox fine for being too burgundy? Why are we always targeted and your friends get a pass? Karen backed up a step, eyes darting. You all agreed to the rules, she said, defensive now. I'm simply enforcing them. Gerald stepped forward from the crowd. You're enforcing your rules, Karen. Not the bylaws, not the codes, just whatever suits you that day. Her lips curled. Careful, Gerald. You're still on probation with the board. He held up a small USB stick. Not for long. She froze. You think we haven't been watching? Gerald said. Think again. Every unapproved fine. Every meeting that never happened. Every reimbursement to Green Ridge Landscaping, which just so happens to be registered to your cousin. Gasps. Karen took a step back. Her face went pale, but Gerald wasn't done. He turned to me and handed over the USB. Everything's on here. Time-stamped, screenshots, emails, the ramp demolition order. She pushed it through without a vote, claimed visual inconsistency as justification. That child's smile meant nothing to her. Just another blemish on her perfect little kingdom. I stared at the device in my hand, and I knew this wasn't just about Elif, or the Rodriguezes, or my driveway. It was bigger, systemic. Karen's grip on this neighborhood was starting to crack, but we couldn't stop there. That evening I invited 5 neighbors to my house. Gerald, the Rodriguezes, Mr. Patel, and Mrs. Kim. We sat around my dining table, blinds drawn, lights low. For the first time, we spoke openly, not just about the past week, but about years of abuse, silence, and fear. And then Gerald pulled out a second folder, this one thicker, marked with handwritten notes and dozens of printed emails. She's been laundering funds, he said flatly. Petty fines, false citations, all funneled into shell accounts. I cross-referenced payment records. Same contractors, same names, same handwriting. Mrs. Kim covered her mouth. My husband always said the numbers didn't add up. They don't, I confirmed. And now, we have proof. A long silence fell across the table. And then I spoke. We need to be smart, strategic. No screaming matches, no Facebook rants. We take this to the county. And if they stall, we go public. Mr. Patel nodded. It's time. Mrs. Rodriguez looked up, teary-eyed, but stronger than I'd ever seen her. She thought she could break us one by one. But together, she can't. And there it was. The beginning of the end. Not with fire. Not with fury. But with evidence. With unity. And with a plan. But Karen wasn't going to give up quietly. We all knew that. She had power. She had allies. She had secrets she hadn't even used yet. And as we stood to leave, Gerald's voice broke the silence one last time. She'll retaliate. I nodded. Let her try. Because the truth? The ramp wasn't the only thing she tore apart. She cracked open a movement. And now? Now, we were building something far stronger than concrete. We were building justice. The first time someone knocked on my door at midnight, I thought it was an emergency. The second time, I knew it was a message. This time, they didn't bother to knock. I woke up to the sound of tires skidding. Then, a loud crack. When I rushed outside, I found my mailbox on the ground, splintered, smashed. A tire mark cutting across the grass. Nothing stolen. Just a message. We're watching you. I didn't call the police. I didn't need to. Because I already knew who did it. Karen had gone quiet since the town hall. But quiet wasn't peace. Quiet was planning. She was pulling strings from behind the curtain again. I could feel it in the HOA bulletins, in the sudden wave of anonymous complaints, and in the reappearance of certain advisors she used to favor. Faces I hadn't seen since the ramp incident. Now, suddenly smiling in doorways again. They weren't done. And neither was I. The next board meeting was scheduled for Friday evening. It was supposed to be a formality. Budget approvals, neighborhood watch schedules, some landscaping contracts. But I had a different agenda. Because while Karen was busy playing puppet master, I'd been reading, digging, cross-referencing every HOA bylaw with municipal code, and comparing financial reports with actual project bids. What I found wasn't just negligence, it was laundering. Under the file marked Community Drainage Improvements, there were 3 invoices, each from different companies. Same amount, same description, same date. But all traced back to the same P.O. box, in a neighboring town where Karen's nephew owned a consulting firm. I printed every document, color-coded them, indexed the inconsistencies, and waited. Friday evening, 6:52 p.m. The rec center was quiet when I arrived, but I wasn't alone for long. Gerald showed up first, still nervous, still adjusting to the idea that he didn't have to nod at everything Karen said anymore. Then came Alicia, newly elected, fiercely independent, and already fed up with HOA drama. By 7 o'clock, we had quorum. Karen walked in 2 minutes late. She wore all black, sharp blazer, blood-red lipstick, clipboard in hand, like she was walking into a courtroom she thought she still controlled. But tonight, she didn't. She opened with her usual performance, polite smile, roll call, a comment about maintaining order in uncertain times. Then she motioned to move on to agenda item number 2. I raised my hand. Karen's smile faltered. Yes, Mr. Langston? I'd like to add an item. Financial audit and contractor review. She blinked. That's not on the agenda. I submitted the request in writing 3 days ago. She didn't answer. Because she knew I did. Gerald cleared his throat. It's a valid request. We have to review it. Karen adjusted her papers. Then, by all means, let's review. I placed the first binder on the table. This is an overview of contractor payments made over the past 18 months. 17 vendors. 11 don't exist in the state registry. 4 have matching tax IDs. And 1, Silver Lake Designs, was listed as drainage infrastructure support. I held up the printed business license. It's a gift shop. Alicia leaned forward. A gift shop? I nodded. Karen's niece owns it. The silence was thick enough to cut, but I didn't stop. I opened binder 2. Here's where it gets worse. Cross-checking community emails, I found that projects were authorized by proxy votes, signatures from homeowners who had no idea they were approving anything. I pointed to the name on the screen, Mrs. Howard, elderly, legally blind. She had approved $7,000 worth of exterior lighting upgrades on a house she hadn't lived in since January. Gerald looked sick. Karen tried to speak. This is wildly out of context. I cut her off. Then explain this. I held up a check. Copied from HOA records. Payable to Karen Chambers. Memo line. Consulting reimbursement. Alicia pushed her chair back. This isn't a meeting anymore, she said. It's an investigation. Karen stood. I won't be a part of this circus. I stayed seated. Calm. You already are. By the time she left the room, half the board had followed her out. Some in shock, some in shame. But not Gerald, not Alicia, not me. We stayed. And for the first time, Westbridge Hills had something Karen couldn't control. A paper trail. That night, I didn't sleep. Not from fear, from purpose. I drafted a report to the county ethics board, submitted evidence to the fraud hotline. And then, I did something no one expected. I went door to door, not with warnings, with truth. I showed neighbors the same binders I brought to the meeting, explained what their fees had really paid for, let them read it for themselves. Some were stunned, others were angry, but most of them, they were ready. Ready for change, ready to vote, ready to take back the neighborhood Karen had ruled for too long. But deep down, I knew something she hadn't realized yet. She thought she was defending her legacy. But all she'd built was an illusion. And once the truth seeped in, once the people saw it clearly, even illusions burn. The flyer wasn't printed on HOA paper. It wasn't folded, sealed, or stamped. It was slid under every door in the neighborhood at 3 a.m. No logo, no contact number. Just bold black text on white stock. Westbridge Hills is under attack. Your property value is at risk. HOA elections have been infiltrated. The truth they feed you is a lie. No signature, no author, just fear, dressed as fact. It hit like a virus. By morning, whispers spread across sidewalks and cul-de-sacs. Elderly neighbors nervously peered through blinds. Working parents reread it twice, unsure whether to toss it or take it seriously. The morning dog walkers exchanged theories. Some thought it was a hoax. Others weren't so sure. But I knew. Karen had moved to phase 2. The smear campaign. By noon, the community app was on fire. Anonymous posts, claims of hidden agendas, and outsiders manipulating HOA power. Screenshots from private messages, some real, some fabricated. A few neighbors started turning cold again. Even Gerald received a text. "You really think they won't come after you next?" He sent me the screenshot, then called, his voice tight. "She's trying to fracture us from the inside." I nodded, which means she's scared. But scared people do stupid things. I paused. Exactly. That afternoon, Alicia received a letter. It looked official, neatly typed, legally formatted, stamped in red ink. But it wasn't from the county. It was from Valley Property Defense Alliance, a name no one had heard of, because it didn't exist. "Ms. Harris, we have received multiple complaints regarding your conduct during HOA meetings. A formal investigation may be launched unless you step down from your position immediately." Alicia didn't flinch. She took a photo and posted it publicly. Fake threats. Real resolve. "I'm not stepping down. Neither should you." Her post went viral, at least by Westbridge standards. And the next night, something shifted. For the first time in Westbridge Hills history, residents called an emergency town assembly. Not the board, not Karen, the people. We met on Saturday at dusk, outside the old elementary school playground because it was neutral ground. Families brought folding chairs, flashlights, thermoses of coffee, even lawn signs saying we deserve better. I stood near the back at first. I didn't want this to be my show. But someone handed me the mic, and I felt the weight of everything we'd been through pressing against my chest. "I didn't come here to fight," I said softly, letting the silence hold for a beat. "But when someone wages war on honesty, on trust, you don't walk away." I raised the flyer. This is fear, and fear is loud when it knows it's losing. Scattered applause. But we are done living under fear. Stronger applause. I looked out at the crowd. Parents, elders, teens holding handmade posters, the Rodriguezes, Mrs. Kim, even the Wilsons, who hadn't attended a meeting in years. Karen thinks she's protecting something. But what she built was never protection. It was a cage. I took a breath. And now, we're tearing it down. The next morning, Gerald called me again. He sounded shaken. "I think I found something." I met him at the park. He didn't speak, just handed me a folder. Inside, photocopies of payment transfers from the HOA escrow account. 3 names, all linked to Greenridge Advisory, a consulting group that hadn't appeared on any previous documents. Alicia called her contact in the state directory. Greenridge wasn't real. It was a shell, registered to a P.O. box in another county. The same county where Karen's ex-husband still owned property. We had just scratched the surface. And now we were falling into something far deeper than citations, ramps, and HOA newsletters. This wasn't about a neighborhood anymore. This was about control. And someone, somewhere, was paying for it. The next morning, I opened my front door to find a neon orange sticker plastered across my storm door. Notice of hazardous conditions. Below that, in smaller print, pending violation review, unsafe ramp structure. I stared at it for a second, then peeled it off slowly. The glue left a tacky residue on the glass. Across the street, Karen was walking her usual patrol route, clipboard in hand like always. But this time, she didn't even try to be discreet. She stared right at me, smirked. She wanted a reaction. I gave her none. Instead, I went inside, booted up my computer, and opened the shared Google Drive folder I'd created with Gerald, Mrs. Leone, and a few others who had finally decided to speak up. Inside were over 40 PDFs, inspection forms, improperly filed citations, and photos of Karen's improvements to her backyard, all of which had been paid for with HOA discretionary funds. What we had wasn't just evidence. It was ammunition. At 9:15 a.m., my phone buzzed. "Check your email," said Gerald's voice. "Karen's filed for an emergency board vote." My heart sank. She was moving fast, trying to officially suspend my HOA privileges before we could make any of this public. Once that happened, she'd be able to block me from community meetings, appeal processes, even the HOA's internal court. And if she got 2/3 of the board to vote with her, it'd be over, at least on paper. But Karen made one fatal miscalculation. She assumed the board was still hers. At noon, I drove to the Westbridge HOA office. I wasn't alone. Gerald was already waiting by the entrance, arms crossed, eyes serious. Behind him, Mrs. Leone leaned on her cane, but stood taller than I'd ever seen her. And beside her, 3 new homeowners who had quietly joined our growing coalition after receiving unjust fines for issues that didn't even exist. We walked in as a unit. Karen sat at the head of the table, flanked by 2 loyalists, Eileen, the treasurer with a fondness for luxury handbags, and Bob, a retiree who Karen had somehow convinced he was acting vice president. Neither looked confident. She didn't stand when we entered, just gestured toward the stack of papers in front of her. "We're here to address escalating tension within the community," she said smoothly, "and to vote on the temporary suspension of Mr. Langston's privileges pending investigation." I raised a brow. "On what grounds?" Karen didn't answer. Instead, she turned to Eileen. "Please read the proposed motion." Eileen looked uncomfortable. Her hands trembled slightly as she read the paper aloud. Something about harassment, improper use of position, and failure to maintain community harmony. I let her finish, then placed a single sheet of paper on the table. It was a certified letter from the County Building Authority, confirming that the destruction of my ramp had triggered an official municipal investigation, one that now included multiple HOA board decisions. Karen went pale, but I wasn't done. I placed a second paper on top of the first. This one, signed by a civil rights attorney, outlined a potential class action lawsuit against the HOA for targeted discrimination against disabled residents. Her voice faltered. This isn't protocol." "No, Karen," I said calmly. "This is accountability." Silence fell over the room. Then Gerald leaned forward. "Before we vote on anything, I'd like to invoke subsection 8.6 of the bylaws." Karen blinked. "Which is?" "The emergency removal clause," he said, "allows for the immediate dismissal of a board member due to misconduct." "You don't have the votes," she snapped. "Actually," said Mrs. Leone, pulling out a small folder, "we do. You didn't read the new amendments filed last quarter, did you? 3 signatures from non-executive board members are enough to trigger a hearing." Karen's mouth opened, then closed again. For the first time, she looked lost, uncertain. Eileen stood up. I abstain from the vote." Bob followed suit. Same. It was happening. Karen was alone, and she knew it. I stood. "This doesn't have to end with lawyers, but it will end with truth. You have 2 choices. Step down and let this community heal, or keep pushing and watch everything you've built collapse under the weight of your ego." Her face hardened, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. because the vote was already in motion. And outside that glass conference room wall, residents were starting to gather, watching, waiting, whispering, not in fear, but in hope, because the tide had turned. And the next wave would wash her out for good. Karen didn't resign that day. She stormed out, not with grace, not with words, just the sharp staccato of her heels against polished tile, her lips pressed thin, eyes darting past the residents who stood outside the glass. She didn't look at anyone directly, but everyone saw her, and no one stopped her. The vote passed minutes later, unanimous. Karen Chambers was formally removed from her position as HOA president. The room erupted, not in cheers, but in something quieter. A collective exhale, a shared release of tension that had wrapped this community like vines for years. But for me, it wasn't over. Because removing Karen from office didn't fix the ramp. It didn't undo the citations, the fines, the humiliation. And it didn't explain the sudden silence that had fallen over the HOA's internal communications for the past 2 weeks. Something was still missing. A reason. So I kept digging. With Gerald's help, and Mrs. Leone's quiet access to archived board minutes, we combed through years of digital records. At first, it was the usual HOA nonsense. Meeting agendas, budgets, fence color debates. But then we found them. Hidden in a subfolder labeled Landscape Grants, Quarter 3. Invoices from a company called Tri-Point Improvements. Paid in full. Repeatedly. For services never rendered. Landscaping on lots that hadn't existed. Repairs on streets that weren't damaged. Thousands, tens of thousands, paid out under Karen's signature. It was a slush fund. And the ramp? My ramp? That was just the cover story. A way to get demolition equipment on my property. To fake repairs. To funnel cash. To keep the audit trail clean. Because Karen hadn't just enforced rules unfairly. She'd weaponized them. And now? Now we had proof. So we made one final call to the County Ethics Committee, the same committee I'd once consulted on zoning violations. This time, I wasn't the expert. I was the whistleblower. The hearing was scheduled 2 weeks later, not in the HOA office, but downtown, where Karen's carefully curated suburban armor couldn't protect her. She arrived flanked by her lawyer, still clinging to the belief that this was a misunderstanding, a political hit job. But as evidence was laid bare, dozens of falsified work orders, manipulated citations, forged emails, the illusion cracked. Even she couldn't spin this. By the time Gerald presented the aerial photographs, proving that Tri-Point's claimed projects never existed, Karen's face had drained to the color of wet paper. The final blow came from an unexpected source. Bob, the Yes Man board member. He stood during the final testimony and cleared his throat. I believed her, he said. She told us it was for the good of the community. I didn't ask questions. I should have. His voice cracked. I'm sorry. The room went still. Karen didn't speak in her defense. She couldn't. Because the only thing more powerful than fear is collective truth. She was disbarred from any future community leadership, fined for fraud, and referred for criminal investigation. But justice wasn't just her fall, it was what followed. Westbridge rewrote its bylaws from scratch. The ramp was rebuilt, not just sturdier, but wider, with decorative railings hand-painted by local kids. A plaque now sits beside it. For all who were silenced, not anymore. And me? I didn't run for the board. I didn't want power. I just wanted peace. But people kept knocking, asking for advice, inviting me to planning meetings, asking me to speak at nearby communities fighting their own HOA nightmares. Because this wasn't just our story anymore. It was a blueprint. For every neighborhood where fear disguised itself as order. For every resident who thought they were alone. They're not. 1 month later, I stood beside Gerald and Mrs. Leone at the new community center ribbon cutting. Neighbors gathered with coffee and folding chairs, laughing without whispers. Children ran freely between garden beds and chalk art contests. And then, someone tapped my shoulder. A woman, late 40s, nervous smile. "I saw what you did," she said. "My HOA's starting to act like yours did. I didn't know we could fight back." "You can," I said. "But not alone." She nodded, and I knew. The story wasn't over. Not really. Because justice, like concrete, needs a solid foundation. But it's the people, the voices, the truth, that hold it together. And this time, we built it to last. They demolished my ramp, but we rebuilt a community.